I yearn for deep understanding, the nature of the cosmos, the essence of consciousness, ultimate meaning or purpose, if there is any. My approach has been science, physics and cosmology, brain and cognitive sciences, and philosophy, largely analytic and focused on metaphysics. Are there other ways of knowing? I'm admonished that there are. The experiential, meditative, mystical. I accept the possibility, but I do not trust my capacity to discern what may be real from what is purely wished. Recently, I was invited to participate in an innovative project with an ambitious theme. Can the arts provide a fresh way to deep understanding? The arts in all its forms, music, painting, sculpture, dance, literature. I love the arts, especially classical music, but I'd never imagined the arts could play such an axial role. Can art seek understanding? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. My interest in the arts as a way of deep understanding was triggered by an initiative of the Templeton Religion Trust called Art Seeking Understanding. Originally, the project was called Aesthetic Cognitivism, focusing on the cognitive value of art in addition to its aesthetic value. Aesthetic cognitivism has art at its best as a kind of understanding and subjects art to scientific thinking and discovery. I'm intrigued, but quietly skeptical. 2 initial workshops are being run, gathering experts from diverse fields: philosophy, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, theology, history, a broad group. The first workshop is in Nassau, the Bahamas. I begin with the originator of the project, Vice President of the Templeton Religion Trust, philosopher W. Christopher Stewart. Chris, what is it about aesthetic cognitivism that has the possibility of letting us see a different view of reality or appreciating what it means to be human?
Aesthetic cognitivism is a theory about the value of the arts, according to which the arts are valuable because they can enhance human understanding of reality. Through engagement with the arts, people come to a better understanding of themselves, of human nature, of the human condition, of human experience, and of moral and spiritual concepts. Many people would argue that the arts are the primary means through which, or context within which, they come to an understanding of those things.
When you talk about art in the context of aesthetic cognitivism, what do you mean by it?
We're very broad-minded about that. So there's visual arts and music, theater and dance, but we even think of it as things like design and fashion even, architecture, or even the culinary arts. Now, we're not particularly interested in what you might call the descriptive question. What is art? We don't start there. That's an interesting question. But a better question is to ask, we think, what is the value of the arts? Aesthetic cognitivists argue that the movement is from art to experience, not the other way around. So you encounter the arts, you have an engagement with the arts, and that changes your perception of reality.
Now, the alternative view is that the arts are almost like an epiphenomenon, the foam on the waves.
Yeah.
That the waves are the real reality, and the art is kind of floating on top of that. But you're saying that that arrow of causation can be reversed.
Exactly, so that your perception of even fundamental categories like space and time, your perspective on a concept or on an event that can change. So in that sense, it alters your understanding, not in the way that arguments do. So the way the arts work is going to be different.
As you look at the emergence of aesthetic cognitivism, what are those disciplines that undergird it?
Well, we're at a point in history where we can actually begin to investigate scientifically how we form beliefs in certain contexts or as a result of certain kinds of experiences. So we're really interested in engaging all of the fields that study cognition that constitute cognitive sciences. So that would include psychology, for example. It would include neuroscience, even a field like linguistics. Some people include computer science there.
Sure, artificial intelligence is now being used to create art.
Exactly, and if part of what we hope to learn from this exercise is something about our humanity, what is unique about human beings, well, certainly creating works of imagination is one of those things. But if it turns out that artificial intelligences and artificial life forms can be developed to the point that they begin to do the same thing, then we'd want to know, well, how do they do that, right? And why do they do that? What is the value of that activity? So the philosophers can help actually sort of define the types of questions, making sure we have conceptual clarity about the questions that we're asking. And I think the theologians and artists also, because we're particularly interested at Templeton in spiritual reality, that would include forces like love or basic values like gratitude and forgiveness and purpose. These are for him spiritual realities as well.
The claim is that through engagement with the arts, humans can better fathom themselves, human experience, human nature, the human condition, even moral principles and spiritual concepts. It's a big idea with a big claim, and it's the benchmark for the Art-Seeking Understanding project. Now that I know project goals, I can dig into the substance by exploring the academic disciplines that collectively form the intellectual foundation of how art seeks understanding. Still in Nassau, I start with philosophy of the arts. I meet the author of a leading on-point textbook, Philosophy of the Arts, An Introduction to Aesthetics, Gordon Graham.
Gordon, how does philosophy of the arts and philosophy in general form the substrate from which aesthetic cognitivism can draw?
It's probably correct to say that it's broadly in the area of epistemology. Aesthetics quite generally has been philosophy of mind for a long time. What kind of experience is it that is an experience of the aesthetic or the experience of the beautiful? In the case of aesthetic cognitivism, where the emphasis to some degree is on the idea of learning and teaching and knowledge, broadly speaking, cognitive values, then there are some long-standing issues in the philosophy of the arts and aesthetics that relate directly to this. These mostly have to do with the concept of imagination. So it's been a question about how far and to what extent imagination has to be involved in the acquisition of knowledge. So if you just take, say, counterfactuals, it looks as though if I do this, then that will happen. If I do that, that will happen. It looks as though there we have to be able to imagine, because necessarily we're not seeing. So it's important in understanding things we have to be able to imagine. How does that relate to imagination in art? And in particular, then, when imagination is given full flight, if I put it that way, does it still retain cognitive value? And a very simple way of putting that, it's a long-standing problem, is the question of truth and fiction. Can you learn things from fictional constructions? And so if you take novels, pure products of the imagination, is there nonetheless something to be learned about life and experience from that? And if we could just get a handle on that, then maybe we could get a better handle on how imagination generates knowledge.
You bifurcated the philosophical foundations of aesthetic cognitivism into two parts, into aesthetics and epistemology.
Yes.
So where are you embedding imagination?
So it's locating imagination back into the faculties of mind and seeing how that has a special role to play alongside perception and intellect, which are the standard sources of knowledge and understanding.
Some would bring theology into this.
I can't quite see that myself. If you think that theology is still about the study of God and knowledge of God and of the divine, then that will raise connections with the aesthetic insofar as you think the aesthetic has a distinctively spiritual dimension to it. But my own story, for what that's worth, is that religious spirituality, religious sensibility, and artistic sensibility can be rivals as well as allies.
Philosophy of art focuses on the experience of the aesthetic, the sense of the beautiful, the nature of imagination, and on epistemology, how do we know art? But Gordon doesn't mention what common knowledge recognizes as essential to the history of art: theology, the Art Religion Nexus. So I jump in with a British philosopher of religion, theology, and the arts. He is also an Anglican priest, David Brown.
David, when I first heard the term aesthetic cognitivism, there are two different interpretations of it. One is the output, the knowledge output of what it may be. The other is the mechanism by which it occurs.
I don't want to call them mechanisms, but distinctive types of approach that are peculiar to the arts and which they also, to some extent, then share with religion, which is one reason why they interest me. So if you think of a poem, if you want to use the word mechanism, it works partly through its metaphors. So at the level of mental cognition, without bringing in science, the question would be, how do these metaphors work? How is that different from, say, a formal argument in philosophy? If you look at a painting, how does an image work as distinct from simply viewing a landscape?
Okay, those are very legitimate questions. What I'm not seeing immediately is how religion comes into this. These are questions that can be asked and judged quite independent of religion.
They can, so not all art has anything to do with religion, but at a basic level, they share something in common, and that is what the arts are doing is they're trying to move you from one area to another. So a metaphor tries to move you from one type of perception to another. See it like this, and then you might understand a different bit of reality. Well, if you like, religion is an extreme form of the arts. It's saying, let's move not just into another bit of this world, but into an altogether different type of reality. But they're doing the same thing, which is why many artists have thought that the best way of communicating religious belief is through poetry or through a painting or whatever.
To David, art and religion enhance each other, partly because each has more than one meaning. Doing theology sometimes drives me to science, moving from what is speculative to what is reasonably sure. It's time I explore the science of aesthetic cognitivism. Which fields form the scientific foundation of art-seeking understanding? How do they focus on art? I meet an experimental psychologist, a pioneer of the cognitive science of religion, Justin Barrett.
The cognitive sciences are an interdisciplinary area that is trying to help us understand how do minds work, how do we think, how do we form concepts, and not just in the explicit kind of reflective way that we might be doing right now as we're talking, but in the sort of intuitive, gut, instinctual almost kind of way that we're not always consciously aware of. And it seems to me just exactly those dynamics are what's at play when we interact with various works of art. It's not just what am I aware of thinking when I encounter a work, but it's what's it doing to me that I'm not even aware of, and maybe begins to work in me that is going to blossom later after I've interacted with it.
What are some specific areas, examples of what that could be?
Well, we could be looking at why is it that some types of artworks provoke us to look at things a new way? Which works and why do they spark our what if, our thinking about hypotheticals? Some works probably are likely to encourage us to ask new questions, new hypotheses that could then guide even our scientific exploration. My guess is that when we start aggressively thinking of the arts from this cognitive science approach, we're going to see what Well, what we've seen in other areas of cultural expression, that what we thought was some kind of roughly unified whole really is lots of different sub-areas with different dynamics, different causal pathways that lead to their expression, different causal consequences, including the consequences on our thinking and feeling.
Cognitive science asks the kinds of questions, thoughts, concepts, reasoning that probe the building blocks of our mental faculties. But isn't art more than the sum of its parts? If cognitive science reveals how the mind processes and appreciates art, then go one level deeper, more fundamental. Cognitive neuroscience reveals how the brain processes and appreciates art. Some months later, the second Aesthetic Cognitivism workshop is held in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I traveled there to meet a medical neurologist, the director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, Anjan Chatterjee.
I think of cognitive neuroscience as asking questions about the mind, what's the nature of the mind, but through the lens of biology, that the mind is implemented through the brain. We can talk about perception, how do our eyes take in different kinds of information and form a representation of the world. Okay. We can talk about our emotions, that people have the experience of joy, anger, happiness, sadness. What's the implementation of those kinds of emotions that most of us experience? We can talk about language, the fact that we are even able to communicate. You can almost think of it as a kind of mind reading. There are these sounds that are coming out of my mouth, and somehow you know what's going on in my head. So these are the kinds of things that people in cognitive neuroscience are interested in.
What are the techniques and the technologies by which you address these questions?
Probably the oldest one would be looking at people with brain damage, for example. Many people might know the name Paul Broca. He made the observation that when you have, in people who had damage to the left side of their brain, that language is affected. The remarkable thing about Broca's observation is the notion that you can have what looks like symmetric organs, but they have dramatically different functions. The one that is quite dominant right now is functional neuroimaging, often referred to as fMRI. And this is a technique where you can tell slight differences in blood flow in different parts of the brain, which is driven by neuronal activity. And so there you can set up experiments where people are put in certain conditions and you see where there are changes in the brain. The way that could apply to aesthetics is you create conditions where people are looking at different kind of objects. Let's take faces, for example. If you're interested in the beauty of faces, when people say aesthetics, often people think of beauty. When you say beauty, people often think of people, right? So you can set up experiments where people are looking at faces that vary in how attractive they are, and then probe for different parts of the brain. So one thing we have found is that in our occipital cortex, which is in the back of the brain, where visual information first comes in, there are parts of the brain that are especially responsive to faces, say, as contrasted with landscapes or architectural interiors. We have shown that as faces become increasingly attractive, you have more neural activity in parts that are specific to faces and not to places. On the other hand, in the front of the brain, within our reward systems, that looking at a beautiful object, in this case faces, is a rewarding experience. We get pleasure from this. And so you have neural activity in those areas. And so to a first approximation, the simplest neuroscientific account of the experience of beauty to a face is the simultaneous activation of our visual, something that is specific to what we're looking at, and the pleasure that goes along with that. And so that would be an example of how you might study the aesthetics of faces. You could do that for landscapes, and you can do that for paintings.
Is a brain explanation of beauty demystifying and thus degrading the splendor of art? I can argue the opposite. How astounding that 3 pounds of meat can make such magic. I've now explored 4 foundations of aesthetic cognitivism: philosophy, theology, cognitive science, neuroscience. I find also attending the workshop is an art historian. What can he contribute? I meet Matthew Milliner.
Matt, in trying to understand aesthetic cognitivism, you've told me that art history should have a seat at this table, and I don't know why.
If we start with history, right, you're going 3000 BC. If you want to talk about art history, then you get 30,000, 40,000 BC. We're on the scene really early as a discipline, seeing what happened to the human brain that caused animals to make pictures of other animals, which is in fact something that animals don't do, right? It's what humans do, and that's what the cave paintings of Chauvet tell us. So we've got to be in the conversation. You can't measure what people in the past did other than through the discipline of art history. You're limited with measurement materials of our time to the data and the people that you can measure right now. When you open up art history, you have the way people have visually processed throughout centuries. That's why we need to be in the conversation, because you don't want to have that chronological snobbery to be stuck right now. It's going to warp the data. It is a banquet, and we're all seated at the table.
Okay.
But I think we do have a dog in that fight as well. I'm not going to completely cede that to the anthropologists, because there are aesthetic dimensions to those paintings that need to be taken into account.
With the foundations of aesthetic cognitivism now surveyed, if not yet explored, how to pull it all together? What's the point of the project? In particular, what's to learn from that change of name? From aesthetic cognitivism to art-seeking understanding. I speak with the project director, program officer at Templeton Religion Trust, Christopher Brewer.
As you look at the whole concept of aesthetic cognitivism as a mechanism for deepening understanding, what have you learned during this interactions with, 24 or so really smart people in diverse fields?
Significant development was rethinking sort of the title of the program theme. Various participants raised issues with both words in aesthetic cognitivism as a program theme. But I've landed on something closer to art-seeking understanding, and I like that for a few reasons. One, there are some resonances there with Christian theological tradition of faith-seeking understanding. There's sort of both a continuity and a discontinuity, maybe a bit of a subversion, suggesting that we could begin with the arts. And what might they have to tell us? But then also by centering on understanding, because I think that some of the participants were worried that we were saying the arts could make propositional claims, say, and some suspecting that they couldn't, and others worrying that we would reduce them to the point of just making some mere propositional claim. And so the title itself, thinking about the arts or art-seeking understanding, I think is more so what we're thinking.
On cognitivism versus understanding. Understanding is differentiated from knowledge. And so how do we differentiate each of those terms, and why is understanding something that is preferable?
Right, so cognitivism, I think, within aesthetic cognitivism is looking at how the arts lead to understanding. So that's not too distant from where we landed. But I think that it can suggest something maybe a little bit too, for some, advocacy-oriented, as if we're advocating one particular view, and also one perhaps too restricted view, which we don't necessarily want to do. The entire project is an open question.
In my lifelong journey and in Closer to Truth's 2-decade pursuit of cosmos consciousness meaning, I'd not had art as a contributor to the quest. I've now come to see art with a role, but how special that role, how meaningful, anything more than a general feeling? Aesthetic cognitivism focuses on a particular kind of cognition, the artistic kind, and takes analytical measures. The change of name from aesthetic cognitivism to art-seeking understanding broadens the scope of the project. To make progress, we explore foundations of the field. Cognitive science, how do minds work? How do we think? Cognitive neuroscience, viewing concepts of the mind through the lens of the brain. philosophy of art, experiencing the aesthetic, sensing the beautiful, appreciating the imaginative. History of art, measuring minds visually. Theology of art, moving from one way of thinking to another, welcoming multiple meanings. Art seeking understanding starts with art and pursues understanding. But it's all still an open question, which is ideal for closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.